is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
In recent weeks, a number of African leaders and foreign ministers have visited Beijing, almost one after the other. Of course, there is nothing entirely new here, other than the frequency of the current visits. This is because African countries have a long history of diplomatic ties and bilateral cooperation with China. The Chinese foreign minister, for example, begins his annual global diplomatic engagements by visiting Africa. However, the current flurry of visits to Beijing is happening within a fluid geopolitical environment and ahead of a pivotal BRICS summit set for Cape Town later in August this year. Well, join us as we explore the relations between China and Africa and the issues that define and strengthen it. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, in recent years, China has increasingly sought to build relationships and engage with African nations, showing its commitment to advancing the continent's economic and social prospects. During the past few weeks, Chinese officials have welcomed several African leaders and diplomats to Beijing, signaling the strengthening of ties. CGTN's Enoxi Collier offers an insight into these visits.
The connection between China and Africa runs deep, characterized by a rich history of cultural exchange and cooperation. This relationship has gained renewed momentum, fueled by mutually beneficial economic ties and a shared commitment to sustainable development. Over the past years, there has been a remarkable surge in visits by African leaders to China as they seek avenues for collaboration in areas such as trade, infrastructure, and technology. One of the most noteworthy recent visits was made by the President of the Democratic Republic of Congo to China. This visit not only fostered bilateral cooperation but also laid the groundwork for long-term partnerships in crucial sectors such as mining, energy, and agriculture. Beyond individual bilateral relations, numerous African countries have expressed their aspiration to join BRICS, an association comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, representing emerging economies. This desire reflects the increasing global influence of African nations and their ambition to become key players on the world stage. The development of BRICS itself as an alternative to more exclusive groups like the G7 holds a particular appeal.
In 2014, the BRICS countries came up with a new development bank as an alternative to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, with more favorable terms for loan agreements to the developing world.
According to experts, the visit of African leaders to China and their aspiration to join BRICS mark a pivotal moment in history. Experts believe African countries being allowed to join BRICS will be a global game changer. Enoxi Collier, CGTN.
Well, let's now bring in our panel to discuss China's evolving relationship with African countries. Joining me from Nairobi, Ambassador Boaz Mbaya, a former Kenyan ambassador to the African Union and Executive Director for the Center for Policy Analysis. In Tel Aviv, Professor John Gong, China Forum expert and Vice President of Research and Strategy at the University of International Business and Economics in Israel. And from Istanbul, Tembisa Fakude, Senior Research Fellow, Africa-Asia Dialogues. Gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you all and thank you for joining us in this discussion. Tembisa, if I may start off with you, we have recently seen quite a large number of high-level visits from African leaders to China. What do these visits to Beijing represent?
Strengthening of ties between China and Africa, and also vice versa. China is very interested in business, and it's certainly going to go ahead and steam ahead with its Belt Road Initiative, which requires, amongst other things, good neighborliness, because if you're going to have a railway and road and all other modes of transportation that will be going through different countries, first you need to have relationships, at least diplomatic good diplomatic relationship with those countries. But also importantly, I think China understands the United States' new position in terms of trying to resuscitate its presence and influence in Africa. And the traffic that we see from the African leaders is not necessarily only sponsored by those countries that visit Beijing or are visiting Beijing, but it's also sponsored by Beijing in terms of strengthening those ties and ensuring that there are no possible temptations to go the other way should other major players that are currently in Africa try and sway African countries against China.
So, Professor Gong, from your perspective, though, what do these visits indicate about China's priorities, particularly in Africa?
Well, Africa is a very important piece in China's foreign policy. As we can see that, usually the first foreign visit by China's foreign minister is traditionally going to Africa. I mean, that speaks volume about the role of Africa in China's international relations space. And I think this is particularly true in the context of ever-increasing participation of Chinese companies in the construction and as well as industrialization of the entire African continent. Today we have hundreds of companies from China, and including Kenya as well, participating in infrastructure build-outs, manufacturing, other types of foreign direct investment, and this is extremely important. And I think it works both ways, from China's perspective as well as from Africa's perspective as well. So I think China is going to be coming to Africa for the long run. And I think the ways that Chinese do things are entirely different, fundamentally different from what the European colonists used to do in Africa in the 18th, 19th centuries.
So we're going to be looking at that fundamental difference in a short while. But Ambassador Mbai, I want to get your opinion on this, because it's been pointed out that the visits are a two-way interest, both from the African side and from the Chinese side. What are the primary motivations, though, for African leaders to see closer engagement with China?
The important thing to note is that Africa comes from probably where China was in about 40 years ago. And we are trying to learn as much as possible how Chinese have done things to be where they are. And I think China provides a very good example on how Africa can then mobilize itself, its resources, its people, and also use proper connections and friendships to develop itself into a formidable economic bloc. What we may probably lack is what China has in terms that China deals with a centralized state, and it is developing as a state, as opposed to very many 54 different countries in Africa who have to coordinate their foreign policy to try and secure the interests of Africans in this particular respect. So there are things we can learn from them, and I think there are things China can teach Africa on how we can then progress by asserting ourselves and also trying to see that we develop in a way in which our independence will have meaning to the people.
All right. So, Tembisa, are there any developing trends at this point, or any development in China-Africa ties that, in your opinion, are potentially transformative for the region?
Oh, yes, of course. I mean, China is not, by the way, China is not only economically involved in Africa, but it's doing other things, including social development and cultural development. There are universities in China that have dedicated resources, energy, and time into recruiting African students to come and study in China, one, to learn the language and understand the culture, with an intention, of course, that later on that will help business between the two continents. And that's, I think, for me, has been one of the most forward-looking and important effort by the Chinese and African countries in ensuring that we cannot ignore the fact that at some point all of us must have an understanding of Mandarin if we are to continue dealing with China, which is the largest supplier of goods and services, and is going to be the case in future. So in that regard, I think China has been very proactive.
Professor Gong, 20 years ago, the advanced economies accounted for about 90% of African exports. But since then, there's been a shift in trading patterns, mainly with Brazil, India and China now accounting for over half of Africa's exports. Has the pandemic era or the current global crisis and the geopolitical realignments we have talked about changed in any way the nature of China's investments in Africa today?
Yeah, well, Africa's trading pattern certainly is going to change together with the entire change in the world's economic epicenter. Today, it's no longer North America or European nations. Today, it's China, Brazil, Southeast Asia, and to some extent Africa as well. And I also hope that there could be more intra-Africa trade, in addition to trade between Africa and other continents. These are the emerging economies. I mean, look at the total economy of the BRICS countries, right? China, Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa. You put them together. In terms of purchasing power parity calculation, that's even larger than the G7 countries' economy. So certainly the world has changed, and I think Africa's trade is going to change as well, based on that fundamental trend difference. Now, I do want to add a bit more about the way, the topic that the previous discussed about the way China does things in Africa that is totally different from previous powers. I think because you know this much better than I do. There's a very famous story told by the Kenyan president recently, saying that you ship 45 African leaders into a bus, okay, put them into a bus and ship them to a hall and wait for an old man come in and give a lecture. This is not the way to deal with African leaders, right? I mean, I don't think that's the way the Chinese government does things with African countries. So, I think this is a very fundamental difference that we do things based on mutual respect, for mutual benefits. And also, I think, more importantly, we do things on a voluntary basis. We don't have any military base, for example, in sub-Saharan countries. When China, in the entire world, has only one base, which is not even called a military base. We call it a logistics base in Djibouti. So, I think these are the fundamental differences. I mean, the commercial network by Chinese companies around the world, in my view, is the first time in human history that it was established without any force behind it. That's a significant achievement in my view.
All right. So, Ambassador Mbai, this is a very interesting perspective here. The West versus other powers and their behavior on the continent, because there is quite a lot of geopolitical realignments happening now. How do you see Western countries viewing China's increasing influence in Africa, and how is this shaping their own engagements and policies towards the continent?
Well, let me put it this way. First of all, China is doing it very, very deliberately, and they are engaged in structural programs which affect the lives of many ordinary Africans. I think what the West is trying to do is to try and catch up with China, and they are trying to do so coincidentally in view of the fast changing international dynamics, because I think the relations with the West has probably, to a very large extent, reached its maturity, and Africa has to look for alternative sources of development funds which do not have too many strings attached to. We have witnessed that the U.S. had a very big opportunity at the collapse of the Soviet Union to direct its efforts to try and shape the world in its own image, but it failed to do so. So it's trying to catch up with China and try and challenge China in Africa so that it gets a bit of the spoils. But I think Africans are probably beginning to accept themselves in a way we have not seen before. So like what President Ruto said, it rings a bell in people's ears. And the West itself, America, and the Western countries themselves will have to take note. After all, as Professor Gong says, the development has diversified, and we are having more players, probably potentially bigger players than the West can now provide. So we have to look at to what extent are we going to benefit from relations by either side. I believe the policy that most African countries have adopted, non-alignment, gives us that opportunity to pick the best from either side and develop our continent to our own satisfaction.
All right, gentlemen, we will take a short break now. But when we come back, we will explore the geopolitical dynamics that are shaping and strengthening the partnership between China and African countries. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion today. Still with me on the program, Ambassador Boaz Mbaya, Professor John Gong, and Tembisa Fakude. Professor Gong, we have seen a flurry of visits to Africa by many Western leaders this year. The U.S., for instance, has made many high-level visits to Africa this year alone. The French president, severally, the German chancellor, among many others. This is quite unprecedented. How do you see geopolitical considerations and competition with other global powers impacting China's engagement in Africa?
Well, I think these people's visit to Africa is against the background of two things, in my view. One is that the West, or what we usually call the collective West, all of a sudden wake up and see that you know, a lot of African countries, actually most of the African countries, if not all the African countries, have taken a position. Not so much on the side of the, you know, the ally of Ukraine in this Ukraine war, but mostly take the position as, say, you know, China, India, and Brazil have taken. So you know, this is not so much to their satisfaction, and they realize that their diplomatic work, their foreign relations work in this part of the world is pretty much ignored in the past few years. The second thing, of course, is the, you know, in the context of competition with China. You know, they see that China is thriving in Africa, Chinese companies are thriving in Africa, and they want to do something about it. China is not peddling these things. China is mostly talking about building infrastructures and you know, bring manufacturing and industrial capability to Africa. China is also trying to close that gap, trying to find things to export from Africa into China. I'll give you one example. Alibaba opened up a hub in Rwanda and trying to sell Rwanda coffee directly to China. It was it's a great success, you know, beyond any imagination. You know, when you talk about coffee, people think Colombia coffee, Brazilian coffee, but today, let me tell you, you know, Rwanda coffee, it sells like hotcakes in China. I think these kinds of opportunities wouldn't have existed if we didn't have this thriving, you know, commercial as well as foreign relations between Africa and China.
Right, Tembisa, you know, China has emerged as Africa's single largest trading partner and is an important lender in recent years. Has the rise of Chinese investment on the continent, for example, reshaped the dynamics of foreign investment in Africa and particularly competition among other foreign countries?
The fact that China is providing a wider range of goods and services into Africa has opened up the African economic opportunities. But importantly is that the manner in which China is engaging with Africa, of course, you know, has also encouraged Africans to not only wait for China, but to go to China to seek more opportunities. Whereas in the past, most of the business that we did with other countries, it was an imposition to an extent. And whenever we were able to travel to various countries, access was almost nil. But we see Africans from small business to big business have a chance to buy tickets, travel to China, buy goods, come back. And that in itself, that access has changed the socio-political landscape in Africa. One, two is that it has also encouraged a different level of interaction between Africa and China. So it has the way we do business, and I agree with my colleagues that China has introduced a different culture. There's something called suitcase business opportunities, where Africans just take suitcases, go to China, buy goods, fill them up, without any problems, come back to Africa and do business. So is at that level that you have this opening of opportunities, and that has indeed changed the trade infrastructure and social political infrastructure in Africa, particularly when it comes to China. We just hope, of course, that it continues. It's not going to be impacted by other factors which have in the past impacted Africa, particularly when it comes to, the enemy of my enemy is my enemy.
Right. Professor Gong, these high-level meetings in Beijing are also coming ahead of the pivotal BRICS summit to be held in Cape Town in South Africa. Now, some 19 countries have expressed their interest in joining the BRICS group of nations. And, notable among them from Africa, countries like Egypt, Algeria, Angola. Why is there such an interest in joining the BRICS group?
Well, I think BRICS, in a way, is actually growing, beyond the original 5 countries. It's pretty much synonymous with what we call the global South. I mean, if you think about what organizations represents their interests, I think BRICS, really qualifies for it, and it's very natural to see other important economies, emerging market economies in the global South trying to join that group as well. What I have read and heard is that, for example, Saudi Arabia is most likely to join this time for the, it's going to be in August, I guess, right? In August, the BRICS meeting in August in South Africa, they probably will announce a few more, 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 other new countries to join the BRICS bloc. And I think, this is a place for these countries to, a platform for these countries to voice their opinions and deal with the rich industrialized world. They have the organization called the G7, and I think we have something called the BRICS, and certainly the BRICS should expand. I think it's going to expand.
Right, Ambassador Mbai, I want to get your view on this. I mean, how do you see the BRICS summit in South Africa, impacting African economies, particularly with all this interest from the continent?
BRICS is important for Africa for 2 reasons. The first is it provides a balance in international relations, because I think it's too one-sided today. The dollarization of the world economy makes United States and Western Europe have too powerful influence on events developing across the world. We need a balance, so that the BRICS will provide that balance by probably creating a parallel economic structure where participation will be seen more on equal terms than is seen through the Western prism. The second part is it balances the world as well, because then we have South-South voice speaking for the majority of the world population against the interests of the Western few countries who claim to be, they call themselves Group of 7. And Group of 7 means it is a pyramid. They are speaking to everybody from the pyramid. So we want a voice to try and balance those kind of imbalances. And that therefore helps African countries to come on board and also have a voice in terms of how development should be seen to affect the majority of the people on this continent.
So, Tembisa, this expansion of BRICS is on the agenda of this week's foreign ministers meeting. What do you see as the potential risks and the opportunities for African countries, particularly those that are expressing interest in joining the BRICS bloc?
Well, I think there's a big potential, economic potential is huge as the developing nations seek to articulate their own position in terms of how they see the world, particularly on the economic direction that the world takes, which unfortunately has been for a very long time been dictated elsewhere. And for the first time, you are seeing this very big bloc seeking a seat in those discussions. So it's key that we build and encourage the proliferation and expansion of BRICS, and hopefully the countries that have suggested to join BRICS will be allowed to do so. And that, of course, will hopefully impact and benefit Africa, because at the end of the day, as Africans, we are keen on seeing economic development. We want to see the elevation of poverty, and want to see our people employed. And if there's anyone or any grouping that seeks to do that in Africa, by all means. And we are seeing that BRICS seem to be much more open to doing that in Africa. And we hope that that's going to happen.
All right, gentlemen, I want to get your final comments as you look ahead to what we expect. What do you see as the prospects for China-Africa ties in coming years, and what are the key factors that will shape this relationship? Tembisa, let me start off with you here.
Well, the future is bright. China is going to continue coming to Africa. And I'm glad, of course, that China is also open-minded in terms of learning cultures and trying very carefully to avoid the mistakes of the past, particularly by former economic partners in Africa. So that combination for me gives me hope that we are likely to see a brighter future between Africa and China, mainly because it's very conscious of how it operates in Africa, how it deals with Africans. It understands, it's got this historical memory of what has happened in the past. It knows the sensitivities that are currently in Africa. And as a result, it's trying very hard to avoid that. But as I've said earlier on, is that it's not China that does business with Africa. It's Chinese businessmen who do business with Africa. And I think the encouragement and caution will be that African countries must put systems in place to ensure that business within Africa from China is facilitated and run smooth, and we don't hit hurdles that have in the past, tempered on relationships between Africa and other businessmen from other nations.
Professor Gong, your take.
Well, I think China and Africa's economic relations continue to deepen, but let me also be very candid and honest here. I mean, there's been some criticisms, for example, the too much excessive debt issue, the issue about employing local employees, stuff like that. I think China is cognizant of that, and we're trying to improve that situation. I know, for example, CGTN's African Bureau employs a lot of local employees, I guess, right, in Kenya. And I hope that a similar kind of a thing would happen across many other Chinese operations from Chinese companies in Africa as well.
All right, Ambassador Mbai, you have the final word.
I think it is important to recognize that China comes a long way with African countries. One, we've been at the United Nations operating as a group of 77 plus China. And that relationship has continued to develop. So nobody should really doubt that it was going to lead to the situation that we are in today. Two, China provides an alternative to the Western mode of operating in terms of trade, economic relations, and so forth. And we are able to learn from what China has done over 40 years. Where there is a way, there is hope. And I think there will be will by African countries to try and learn from how China has done it, and we do it the same way ourselves.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for being a part of this discussion. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts joining us from Nairobi, Ambassador Boaz Mbaya, a former Kenyan ambassador to the African Union and Executive Director for the Center for Policy Analysis. In Tel Aviv, Professor John Gong, China Forum expert and Vice President of Research and Strategy at the University of International Business and Economics in Israel. And in Istanbul, Tembisa Fakude, Senior Research Fellow, Africa-Asia Dialogues. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more at Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.